We're going to get to the argument from Judge Luttig in a moment, but first I want to start with the hypocrisy of Todd Blanche. Here he is on Friday speaking to police officers in Long Island.
In my Department of Justice, if anybody touches a federal law enforcement officer in any way inappropriate, we will prosecute them to the fullest extent of the law.
Scott, you pointed out that hypocrisy.
Well, there's hypocrisy, and then there's capital H, capital Y, hypocrisy. There were 1,500 plus January 6th riot defendants, several hundred of whom either admitted to or were accused of beating cops, all of them pardoned. All of them now in line, or at least many of them in line, to get taxpayer-funded payouts. And let me tell you why Todd Blanche is critical here, even without a slush fund. Todd Blanche is the one who can sign off on any settlement of a federal civil lawsuit by a January 6th riot defendant and ensure taxpayer money is handed out. Even if that riot defendant has no reasonable case to make to a civil jury, he can greenlight the payouts. And we know this in part because, Katie, some of them are lining up already. Just in the last week, another riot defendant filed a civil suit here in Washington seeking compensatory and punitive damages for her economic and reputational harms.
All right, Lisa, they're going to try to get that money, can they?
They shouldn't be able to, and I'll tell you why. The Federal Tort Claims Act, which is what Todd Blanche has really been tacitly referring to when he talks about these payouts to January 6 defendants, it requires that you file a claim with the federal government 2 years after you've been injured. And in fact, his own Department of Justice has gone in, Katie, to a Florida court and said, essentially, it's too late for a group of people who say that they were struck, physically injured on January 6th by being bystanders on that day, bystanders being their own characterization. But he is definitely signaling a desire to pay them. I'm going to read to you something he said to Kristen Welker on Meet the Press yesterday during his Sunday morning talk show tour. He said, there is a process in place where if you believe that you've had a tort committed against you by the government, whether it's slipping on ice outside of a federal post office or a law enforcement officer assaulting you, you are allowed to seek compensation. That is technically true. In an ordinary Department of Justice, somebody has 2 years to do it. And Todd Blanche's Department of Justice, they may have more. I should tell you that when the Department of Justice pays these people out, they owe a report every year to Congress saying, not only they, but other agencies as well, sort of an aggregate report on these kinds of payouts, but they never say who they've paid, and they never say exactly why they've paid. They owe them information in the aggregate, like sum of money, the law firm, the defendant agency. But we won't get granular details about whether certain January 6 defendants were paid and on what basis the department decided they were worth paying.
We mentioned Jon Ossoff going after Mike Collins for that. That's easy. Yes, Democrats have been trying to campaign on the weaponization fund as well. I wonder, Tim, we have some polling to put up regarding how people feel about it. Generally not good. I wonder, though, do the folks with the thin blue line flags, the ones that say support law enforcement, do they bristle at this hypocrisy? Do they vote against it?
Maybe some of them. You don't want to paint with too broad of a brush, Katie, but I think that we saw from that rally, just as a quick aside, it's pretty strange that the Attorney General of the United States was speaking at a campaign rally on behalf of New York's governor candidate with a bunch of cops in uniform behind him. That is something that is not in our tradition in a democratic country, to say the least, and it is against the norms and the rules of the DOJ prior to this administration. But I think the fact that he was there and that it didn't seem like anybody was booing him is a sign that, for whatever reason, a lot of the thin blue line crowd does give a carve out for January 6th. But I don't think those, like the most passionate, MAGA pro-police voters are the people that Jon Ossoff's trying to reach. I think that there are a lot of people that have respect for police officers, want support law and order, who are not, deep MAGA partisans, that are turned off by this. I think that there are people that, just as a broader theme, something Jon Ossoff's been very good at tapping into, don't like the corruption and the unfairness of what we've seen from this administration, where they're going to pay out money, their their hard-earned taxpayer money to people that stormed the Capitol and beat up cops. There are a lot of people in Georgia who maybe were Mitt Romney voters a decade ago or more who don't support that, don't want that, and are unhappy with the fact that the Republicans have nominated like a really extreme candidate, even within a batch of pretty extreme candidates, maybe the most extreme nominee for the Senate there. And I think that's why we're seeing Jon Ossoff run away with that race right now.
So what is the pardoning of the January 6ers, the potential to pay them out? Todd Blanche, saying that people were unfairly prosecuted. What message, Tim Hayfie, does that send to the Department of Justice?
Look, Katie, if you believe, as I do, I was a federal prosecutor for a long time, that criminal consequences actually deter bad behavior, then the easy flip side of that is excusing criminal behavior encourages more of it, right? I think I saw something where over 100 of these pardoned January 6ers have already, since the pardons, been rearrested for other crimes. And it's not just them that get the message that there's sort of a get out of jail free card. It's everyone else who believes, hey, as long as I'm doing things in general support of this president and this administration, then I can do what I want. And that sends a terrible message. It undercuts the rule of law, and it makes us less safe.
So let's get to Luttig's argument that this is all an effort to fertilize the ground for another attempt to steal an election. Scott, have you heard anything on Capitol Hill about plans to potentially not seat Democratic winners?
Top Democrat on the House Committee on Administration, Joe Morelli of New York, who has oversight over federal elections issues, is talking us down from that being a concern. He's far more concerned with these efforts to sow disinformation to chill people from voting in the first place. Falsely claiming ICE is going to be at the polls could disincentivize people from actually wanting to go vote. That's the primary concern. On January 3rd at 12 p.m., there is no more Speaker Mike Johnson. They haven't elected a speaker when the new Congress starts, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of widespread concerns about Mike Johnson stopping a Democratic-run U.S. House from being seated. But they're doing everything according to the playbook of 2020 of sowing distrust before the election so that there can be, on Election Day and the day after, the potential of conspiracy theories flourishing and possible unrest with people who are dissatisfied with the results and believe all of this conspiracy theory nonsense about there being fraud.
Yeah, it's that space in between. So, Tim Miller, one of the arguments that I want to make on Donald Trump is that he doesn't have these authorities. He can't declare a national emergency on elections. This is the stuff that will get struck down in court. I mean, he's been struck down in court a lot. But he needs to project that he has that authority. He needs to project that he is the only person in this country who is in charge. So he's going to do so, and he's going to say he's going to, he's not going to rule out a national emergency. He's going to flirt with the idea of, seizing voting machines. He's going to say the only way the Democrats can win is if there is fraud, et cetera. Are you as concerned about the disinformation and the suppression, or are you more concerned about, I know there's no Speaker Mike Johnson on January 3rd, 2027, but what Republicans might try to stop Democrats from doing in the chamber?
Look, this is a judgment call. I think that everybody needs to be vigilant on all fronts. Personally speaking, the suppression is kind of what worries me less. I think that there's a lot of data that shows that when they try to suppress the vote, most oftentimes that leads to a backlash effect. I think that, again, Democrats and states need to be vigilant about what that looks like. There's certainly ways that voter suppression has been successful in the past, so it's not a 0% chance, but a lot of times that backfires. I think that the two things to be concerned about, as Scott mentioned, one is the proliferation of disinformation and what that has, and Trump's projection of power, as you mentioned, Katie. Look, he's going to try everything, and this is Trump. We know at this point for 10 years. He's going to try to push the limits of his power, and push every button possible. And if some of them, he gets rejected, but he's successful in others, he considers that a win. And, we're seeing this in the ballroom. You're seeing this with ICE, and you see this across the board, right? Like he goes for a maximalist effort. And then, if he still, gets additional powers that were not granted to other presidents or additional political opportunities that he wouldn't have had otherwise. Like, he sees that as a win. So that's Trump. And I think it's important to push back against him across the board. My only slight quibble with Scott on the post-election concerns is, look, this is a line that the Republicans used to use fraudulently in 2024, which is, it needs to be, the victory needs to be too big to steal. But that is kind of a legitimate way that the Democrats need to think about it this midterm, because if they do win by enough votes in the states where these candidates are going to be seated, then Scott's point is correct and Joe Morelli's point is correct, that there's nothing that the Republicans can do. If it ends up being very close and there are a lot of races in California, let's say, that are out for a month because of mail-in ballots, that does create a lot of time after the election for troublemaking. And that is something that really concerns me, and I think it's important to monitor. And I think on the Senate side, maybe if this falls down to one state where it's a Republican state, say Texas, where that ends up being a close race and that is the deciding Senate seat, there could be issues after the election there as well.
I think you're right about that. So, Tim Heaphy, given that, what sort of legal theory are you brushing up on ahead of November?
Yeah, Katie, look, the best indication of future performance is past conduct, right? And we already saw this 8 years ago in 2001 with respect to a methodical, intentional plan to disrupt the joint session. That was thwarted by people that stood up and did the right thing and protected the rule of law. I worry that those people are not there, did not get hired in this administration or elected to Congress, and therefore the guardrails weren't there. There's already a lot of litigation here. Elections are state functions under our constitutional system. I think you'll continue to see public interest groups filing cases to push back against subpoenas of ballots or the attempt to in any way federalize the election, but it'll be a case-by-case basis. Judges around the country, federal and state, will have to intervene. Again, an army of talented lawyers will be prepared, but the judiciary in some ways is our last guardrail, not just with respect to elections, but a lot of executive overreach we've seen over the past year and a half.